When we hear the phrase one-man army, our minds tend to drift toward myth. We picture a lone figure cut from heroic cloth, standing against a horde, surviving against impossible odds. It is a concept that, in the modern analysis of warfare, we are often trained to dismiss. Modern military doctrine emphasizes combined arms, fire, and maneuver, and the synergy of a unit. The idea of a single soldier decisively turning the tide of a battle is viewed as an anomaly, a Hollywood trope, or at best, a momentary aberration in the chaos of combat. But every so often a case emerges from the fog of war that is so meticulously documented, so tactically raw, that it forces us to reevaluate our assumptions about human agency in battle. The story of Manuel V. Mendoza is one of those cases. It is not just a story of courage, it is a story about the terrifying math of close-quarters combat, the limitations of standard citation reviews, and how a man, from the copper mining towns of Arizona, executed a sequence of actions that, for nearly 70 years, the official record simply failed to categorize correctly. To understand why his actions matter, we have to strip away the legend and look at the ground he stood on, the weapons he used, and the specific tactical problem he solved with his bare hands. By October of 1944, the Italian campaign had become a war of attrition fought vertically. The Allies had breached the Gothic line, but the retreating Germans were fighting a masterful defensive battle in the Apennine Mountains. The 88th Infantry Division, the Blue Devils, had captured Mount Battaglia, a critical peak that offered observation over the German supply routes. But holding the mountain was its own kind of hell. The terrain was jagged, the weather was turning cold and wet, and resupply was a nightmare of mule trains and human porters. On the afternoon of October 4th, the German 290th Grenadier Regiment decided they wanted the peak back. They did not want it with a probing attack or a feint. They wanted it with overwhelming violent force. The German counterattack was preceded by a heavy mortar barrage. This was not just harassment, it was a tactical tool designed to pin the defenders in their holes and shred any communication wires. Staff Sergeant Mendoza, a platoon sergeant with Company B, was caught in that barrage. He was already wounded. Shrapnel or bullets had torn into his arm and leg. In the context of a tactical retreat or a defensive crouch, a wounded non-commissioned officer has every right to seek cover and direct his men from a relatively safe position. But when Mendoza looked over the crest of that hill, he saw a tactical disaster unfolding. Approximately 200 German troops were advancing up the slope. They were not just carrying rifles, they were equipped with flamethrowers and machine pistols. This was a shock troop assault designed to annihilate the American position in one swift burning rush. What Mendoza did next is often summarized in citation language as gallantry and intrepidity, but to a survivalist or a historian, the sequence is a masterclass in aggressive, adaptive weapons utilization. Mendoza did not simply fire a single weapon until the threat was gone. He ran through an entire armory in a matter of minutes, diagnosing the tactical situation and changing his tools to meet the threat. He first grabbed a Thompson submachine gun. He expended 5 magazines from a position on the crest, killing 10 Germans. But the Thompson, while excellent for close quarters, has a relatively slow rate of fire compared to modern weapons and a limited effective range. When the ammunition ran dry, he did not take cover to reload. He transitioned. He picked up an M1 carbine that was nearby and emptied that magazine into the advancing ranks. It is at this point in the narrative where the distance between a hero and a one-man army becomes clear. A flamethrower operator, the most terrifying weapon on that hillside, was about to crest the hill. If that soldier had made it into the American trenches, he could have incinerated the defenders in seconds. Mendoza drew his sidearm, a standard .45 pistol, and eliminated the flamethrower operator. But eliminating one man still left nearly 200. Seeing that his position was still untenable, he jumped into an abandoned machine gun emplacement. He opened fire, but quickly realized the fixed position limited his field of fire against the dispersed German assault. So, he physically picked up the machine gun, walked forward into the kill zone, and began firing from the hip. This is a detail that is often glossed over. Firing a machine gun from the hip is inaccurate and difficult to control. It consumes ammunition at a terrifying rate, but Mendoza was not aiming for precision. He was aiming for psychological impact. The sight of a wounded American walking toward them, spraying a heavy volume of fire, caused the German assault to lose its cohesion. He created confusion. He broke their momentum. When that machine gun jammed, which is almost inevitable when firing in such a manner, he did not retreat. He transitioned to hand grenades, throwing them into the confused mass of German soldiers until they finally broke and withdrew. When the hill was silent, Mendoza did something that defines the mentality of a professional soldier versus a desperate defender. He advanced down the forward slope, alone, into the area where the enemy had just been. He collected enemy weapons scattered across the battlefield and, remarkably, captured a wounded German soldier, bringing him back to the American lines to consolidate the position. By the time it was over, he had personally accounted for 30 German dead and had saved his company from being overrun. For this action, Mendoza was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, and for decades that was, well, the final word. He went home, served again in Korea where he was wounded a second time, and lived a quiet life in Mesa, Arizona. He worked odd jobs, eventually becoming a foreman at the Palo Verde nuclear generating station. Like so many of his generation, he did not speak of the war. His daughter Sylvia learned of his exploits not from him but from a book she found as a 12-year-old. Now this silence is often romanticized, but it carries a heavier context. For Hispanic American veterans like Mendoza, the silence was not just about trauma, it was about the reality of returning to a country that still viewed them through the lens of prejudice. He was a hero in uniform, but a minority in civilian life. The turning of the record came not from the battlefield but from the halls of Congress. In 2002, the Defense Authorization Act mandated a review of Jewish American and Hispanic American veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam who had received the Distinguished Service Cross. The goal was to determine if prejudice had played a role in denying them the Medal of Honor. This review was not about rewriting history, it was about correcting a known statistical anomaly. When historians and military boards re-examined Mendoza's case, they realized that the initial decision, made in the chaos of war, had simply undervalued the tactical impact of his actions. The Distinguished Service Cross recognized bravery. The Medal of Honor recognizes a specific, rare kind of action that changes the course of a battle. Mendoza's stand was the latter. In 2014, nearly 70 years after the fact and 13 years after his death, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor to Mendoza's widow, Alice. In the East Room of the White House, the president spoke of confronting a painful past and correcting the mistakes of the nation. For viewers of Our Mamabak, Bet Our Beat States. Power. The lesson here is not simply that the government finally fixed a clerical error. The lesson is about the long arc of historical truth. It reveals that the fog of war does not just exist on the battlefield, it exists in the bureaucracy that follows. It took a congressionally mandated systematic review, a deep dive audit of valor, to bring the full scope of Mendoza's actions to light. Manuel Mendoza's story forces us to hold two truths simultaneously. On one hand, it reinforces the power of the individual. One man, wounded, alone, and outnumbered, can stand his ground and change the outcome of a tactical engagement. His ability to transition between weapons, to expose himself to fire to break the enemy's morale, and to continue fighting even after his body had given up, is a study in human endurance under extreme duress. It is a case study for anyone interested in survival or combat leadership. When the ammunition runs out, you find more. When one weapon fails, you pick up another. When the enemy expects you to retreat, you advance. But on the other hand, his story is a cautionary tale about how we remember. It reminds us that for every story like Mendoza's that is finally corrected, there may be others still buried in archives, victims of the unspoken biases of their time. Remembering Mendoza is not just about honoring a man from Miami, Arizona. It is about acknowledging that the full cost of war includes the stories we fail to tell correctly the first time. It is about understanding that the line between a distinguished action and an act above and beyond is sometimes drawn not by the events themselves, but by the eyes that witness them and the hands that file the paperwork. Mendoza held the line on Mount Battaglia with a machine gun and hand grenades. His family held the line for decades, waiting for the record to catch up with the reality. If you found this deep dive into the overlooked corners of military history valuable, make sure to subscribe to War Machiner. We don't do surface-level summaries, we dig into the context, the consequences, and the hard truths that other channels leave behind. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what above and beyond the Call of Duty really looks like. Hit the subscribe button and join the mission to remember the stories that shape the world we live in.